Thank you, and thank you, Antonio. This opinion that Antonio was mentioning, well, we've used as a legal strategy in ICEERS, and it is a program that I am privileged to coordinate within ICEERS. We provide legal support to all those people that some way or another have some issue in relation to some ayahuasca use, not always ayahuasca. We don't discriminate among plants, so we could talk about peyote and psilocybis, mushrooms, and other plants. But I would like to mention in the ADF, Ayahuasca Defense Fund, that the latest trends that we have identified in the recent months, and I would like to cover the 3 trends in the judicial legal resolutions, the rulings that we have come across with at the ADF, Ayahuasca Defense Fund. So this is a symbol, really, that you see on the screen of what goes on. And these are the countries where ADF has been doing some advocacy, because there have been legal issues, and some cases have even been taken to court. So, you know, criminal right is involved, and human rights and international rights, and then every country responds to their own legal and juridical anthropology, and depending on the place, some arguments work, some others don't. In the United States, freedom of religion works, and in other Latin American countries, that's not really viable. Here's a map. I'm a lawyer, so that's quite an achievement, because I'm not very good at the graphs. Here you see the countries where there's greater concentration of cases in the recent years. Ayahuasca is the main one. You see those centers, the core of the situation last year. There were more arrests last year, more seizures of ayahuasca in Israel and Russia. So quite a lot of batches were seized. And as we speak, there are 3 people facing trial, 2 in Russia. They are preventatively in jail for 2 years now already. Another person is right now, as we speak, arrested in Spain, here in Spain, and a 3rd person that's waiting for a ruling, for having imported San Pedro into Ireland. So this is a summary of the recent past. And of course, before the formal creation of ADF, we didn't have the way to determine the number of legal incidents in the world. We couldn't quantify them, but this graph points to the fact that ever since ADF exists, 130 cases we've encountered until yesterday, I should say. And you see the figures for Spain and the rest of Europe. Important challenges in France, where control is harsh. Also in Germany, some incidents, and in Argentina recently there's been an incident because the drug policy and the enforcement of drug-related acts has been toughening in the past few months. And last but not least, in order to monitor the progress with the years, in 2006, that's when ADF consolidated, so we saw an increase, but that is because we could then have access to more data. We gathered more information, and I also need to say that the data that I'm sharing here with you usually don't respond to absolute reality, because I'm only speaking of the cases that we encounter at the ADF. And in some other places, people just don't know about our existence, about the existence of our program at ADF, so they don't report their cases to us. So that's why. In the past months and years, we've detected that, legally speaking, there are 3 sets of sentences and resolutions that the authorities have interpreted, and the first, or the most restrictive one, responds much more to drug control, really, at the same time stemming from the application, nearly direct application of the international conventions mentioned by Antonio. Then, second, a type of interpretation that tries to be more harmonious in between the most restrictive one and another interpretation that is looser, favors more human rights without taking the risk of really setting precedent to say that ayahuasca is not controlled nationally and internationally. And a third interpretation, that's what I call the biocultural type of interpretation, and that is new in different jurisdiction, and I'll explain this in a minute. But I would like to focus first on the most restrictive interpretation. And this reduces the richness, spiritual, traditional richness is reduced down to the molecules. And that is a trend, ongoing trend. And even in the end, even if the result is positive, of course it's reductionist and it's costly. The most restrictive interpretation judges the molecule as the absolute quantity, and that we've encountered in Russia, and we've seen this in the jurisdictions that I was describing before. I mean, they disregard all other or any human rights for that matter. Then the more harmonious interpretation of the law, we tend to see this more in Europe, even if they enforce the treaties, drug control treaties, they try to harmonize the implementation and the enforcement, taking into account the national and international trends, and there are bodies of rights, international human rights system and the international drug control that sometimes contradict each other. So this harmonious or harmonizing interpretation that is beneficial for the person at stake, that doesn't set a precedent either that we can use to follow the path that we would like to follow, which is precisely to have an interpretation stemming from the opinion presented by Antonio. And the third style of interpreting the norm, which is what I call the biocultural one, coming from Latin America, referring to the inter-American human rights system. Since 2016 to date, we've seen some decisions, some rulings that have got our attention, because it seems that that's where we can start working on our strategy, our juridical strategy, to set a precedent and to set priorities on human rights, focusing on human rights and understanding ayahuasca and putting ayahuasca in the light of international human rights. And we try to work hard for this, just like we would fight for cultural rights and environmental rights and the right to cultures and the right to indigenous traditions, etc. In the year 2018, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights presented their preventative measures, and when they consider that there's extreme severity and emergency in terms of human rights in some place, some measures, precautionary measures, can be passed in order to protect the communities that are at stake, in danger. And that was the case in Colombia. The Siona community, the indigenous Siona, there was a resolution by the court saying that some groups are on the verge of extinction, really. They dictated these precautionary measures to protect the Siona communities. However, they took Yahé as a spiritual protection for the Siona people and as a fundamental tool for decision-making purposes and in order to cope with the crisis, apart from the narcotics and their constant breaches of rights that are occurring in Colombia. The Inter-American Commission passed these precautionary measures in favor of the Siona people, but making their emphasis on Yahé, and the system quite advanced in terms of drug control, and that is a landmark for the consideration of ayahuasca as a pillar that could be advocated for along the lines of human rights, so a little bit apart from drug control. And before this resolution in 2006, let me say that in Colombia, 2 rulings have been passed that are crucial for the case law in Latin America. The Court of Justice in Colombia dictated that in Colombian Amazon, that they were a community with their rights. The Court of Justice in Colombia tried to set or to find connections between the territory and their medicines, the indigenous peoples and their medicines and their nature, and that changes the interpretation that we have been following in national international courts of an anthropogenic or anthropocentristic view, and now it's more ecocentristic, and they are capable of seeing in nature a component. It's not that nature belongs to us, but we belong to nature. Even most interesting, they interpret things by virtue of the conventions of Paris 2015 for climate change. And there are a series of interpretations pointing to the fact that we could maybe have or find a solution there for those people that are suffering some sort of conflict because of their plant use, and that is applicable also to the coca leaf, also San Pedro and peyote that are also at the brink of extinction. So simply, just to mention the tensions that we have in the ADF. The ADF is a lab to monitor our drug control policies, and the solution that we find, because we're finding more and more solutions to these tensions. And the last thing I want to say, in the ADF, it's a paradox, but usually whatever ends up being legal, it's not necessarily the fairest thing. And not everything that's just ends up being legal, because sometimes there's bargaining and negotiations, and somebody needs to plead guilty not to face charges. So it's very dynamic, but faced with inconsistencies in the narrative, in drug control narratives, and the relationship with human rights that some advocate. Of course, they come first for many of us, but apparently there are other ways of developing things apart from what Antonio referred to in his book. So that's my time. My time is up. Thank you very much for being here. It's Sunday and hearing about laws and politics on Sunday, sunny Sunday. Not very pleasant. Thank you for joining us.